Hello.
Hello.
Uh, Welcome to another Museum FAQ video. I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator of Paul Orselli Workshop here on Long Island. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Christian Greer, currently at the Michigan Science Center, although really currently in Chicago, but here
Right,
we
right.
are. So Christian, thanks for joining me. I always like to start out by having people tell us a little bit about their background and how they got into the museum world. So you could start out with that. That'd be great.
Sure. Well, Paul, it's great to have an opportunity to be with you, and I really love what you're doing. You know, especially times like these, people are online and they're looking for questions, answers, solutions. People that are struggling doing with some of the same things, especially during this COVID-19 um, crisis and the impacts of those that have on our organization. So happy to be here.
Well,
Um,
no pressure, Christian, with that buildup. So.
right, right. Love what you're doing. But just give a little bit about my background. As you mentioned, I'm from Chicago originally, and now as a president and CEO at the Michigan Science Center in Detroit. It's interesting. I never thought that I would be a president and CEO. Didn't really have any goal to be one. Although if you hang around long enough, you get involved in lots of different things, and all of a sudden avenues open up, and if you're ready for them and they're ready for you, which is probably the most important part of that equation, you can continue to lead and serve an organization and the field, which is what I'm very privileged to be able to do. But that being said, I started off just in a family learning environment, growing up in a family of teachers. And so we were always emphasizing learning, and my siblings and we had a really good opportunity to explore science in our museums, our local museums. And anyone that's been to Chicago knows we have a great museum system there. And when I was growing up way back when, they were all free. So you could just kind of walk in and explore. A lot different now in terms of how much you have to pay to get in, but we were members back then. And so we got a chance to go behind the scenes to all the cool new things. And I went to the Field Museum of Natural History, the Shed Aquarium, to the Museum of Science and Industry, lots of different museums. And I think the one that I enjoyed the most was the Adler Planetarium. I had an interest in space in the period in which I was growing up. We had Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica, and I still remember watching 2001: A Space Odyssey. So I had a fascination for it. And they didn't have kids classes back then. So we went to the events, but there weren't that many courses for kids. So we always wanted to get and be in part of the process. And it's interesting, Paul, that Phyllis Pitluka, who was one of the astronomers that was there, she said, well, because you guys are members, I'll let you into the course as little kids, but you have to sit in the back and be quiet, right?
Be quiet.
That's the most important. Sit all the way in the back and be quiet. And so we were like, okay, we'll do that. And we pretty much adhered to that. And I just remember, the old Kodak slide projectors and going through galaxies and quasars. And I kind of got some of it. A lot of it was over my head, but it was more the impression, the wonder that was generated from being at the planetarium in a museum environment with people talking about things that might have been just beyond my understanding, but I was still curious. And so that's how I got my start. So if that's not a great entree into being in a museum environment and feeling comfortable there, that's
Well,
it.
you were both a museum kid and a space kid, so
That's right. That's
that's
right.
great.
What's interesting, if I may just add this part, I never thought that I would be working at Adler Planetarium, and that ended up being my first museum job. I was hired on as an intern's assistant. If you've ever heard of such a thing, I didn't know there was such a thing, but the intern there actually had an assistant, and that was me. And I ended up becoming their year-long intern. I was incidentally the first intern to ever get hired in the maybe 20 years of that program, and just by happenstance. And there were a lot of people that became NASA controllers, and they were over other planetariums. But somehow or another, I was in the right place at the right time, got hired, and that kind of kicked off my career. So love being in this work. I love the people working with people like you that are creative and dynamic and always push the envelope. I like to experiment, but I don't like to do it alone. That's not always good. So at least if you have some study
Yeah,
buddies.
especially exhibits and programs, they're a team sport.
Yes, yes, hopefully. Yeah. So I don't know how much you want to go through the
No,
rest of
you
the
just
background, but
briefly, if you can
okay.
touch on, because I know you've worked in St. Louis, and obviously now
Oh
you're in
yes.
Detroit.
So yeah,
Just sort of round out your
round it out.
your United States tour of museums.
Yeah, yeah. So I never thought I would go into marine biology or anything, associated with aquatic science, but I ended up being recruited from Adler Planetarium to go down the street from 1300 South Solidarity Drive to 1200 Solidarity Drive to the Shed Aquarium, which is a fantastic place. I worked there for most of the longest I think I've ever been somewhere. I actually worked there twice. I left Shed Aquarium to go to the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. At that time, I worked as a theater programs manager, IMAX, planetarium stuff, and then came back to Shed. And actually, before I came back to Shed, I had another job opportunity at St. Louis Science Center. And I had a big decision to make whether I would go back to Shed or go to someplace new. I went back to Shed, and who would have known after working to a couple of other places that I would have ended up back in St. Louis at the St. Louis Science Center. And I left the Shed as the Senior Director of Education. So I come up with the education exhibit side of things, and then the Chief Officer of Science Education and Experience at St. Louis Science Center, and then now most recently at the Michigan Science Center in Detroit as the President and CEO. So that's sort of academically, physics and
Wow,
astronomy. I'm a certified project manager. I am working on a doctorate in learning technologies, so all about
wow,
communicating online. So
that's awesome.
I'm hoping to retire next week. I can't do
Well,
anymore.
I don't know if you're going to retire, but you're probably pretty tired. But
I am, yeah, the tired part, absolutely. And retiring at this time with this economy would not be, even if I had the opportunity, which I don't. I'll probably work until I die. But yeah, it's not really such a good time to retire
yeah,
right
those I'm sure those kids at home like to eat.
now. They do. They do.
So, well, that's great. You and I have worked all over the country in
Yeah.
different museums. That's super. Well, I'd like to take the opportunity today, especially with your background, the CPM background, but also now in your current role as CEO and Executive Director at the Michigan Science Center, to talk a little bit about managing during transition times.
Mm,
And of course, there are all kinds of transitions. There are things out of our control, like tornadoes or earthquakes that have impacted museums in different parts of the world, and sometimes economic things or structural things or what have you within an organization or museum planning to grow, capital campaigns.
mhm.
There are all sorts of challenges for an able executive. Lucky you. But
Yeah, right.
I wondered if maybe you, especially now, we're recording this during COVID-19 and the pandemic, but
Right.
just in general too. I really think of these as evergreen topics, these museum FAQ videos, and certainly transitions will always be happening, and there will be decisions to be made and approaches to take. So I just wanted to throw that out to you and just get your thoughts in terms of now during a time of definite transition, but also in general, things you think about, um, tips or techniques that you might share with colleagues or resources that you think are valuable when people are considering managing through transitions.
Well, Paul, you threw out a bunch of questions there, and it really caused me to be really reflective about it because, you're right. I mean, it seems like we're always in transition, and you might imagine that leadership in and of itself is about managing transition. So perhaps you have presented a definition that I think is apropos, especially now, but just, in general. One of the most invariant qualities, quantities of leadership is change. And I think that's why people look to you as a leader, even when you don't want to be a leader, is they looking for change and they want a guide. And sometimes you can lead from the front and, point out that way is where we're going. Other times you're kind of looking back and saying, come on, guys, I know the way. But I think in today's society, a lot of it happens where you're more shoulder to shoulder. And when crisis hits, I think that might be a safer place to be. It's not easy to manage during these kinds of challenges. Certainly as a president and CEO, and I'm a freshman, so I just started in this process, haven't even completed a year. And coming to the Michigan Science Center, which arguably was in a turnaround situation that we were trying to create, or at least to advance to a new level of operation, been challenging for us as an organization. The team is already undersized. We don't have really huge budgets, not a big runway of cash on hand to be able to, get this plane back going again and into the air. It's scary sometimes, and the previous organization, the Detroit Science Center, had closed. So we've been down that road. And if you live in Detroit and you haven't been part of a layoff or a shutdown or something going out of business, it's almost, it's a good thing and a bad thing. In Detroit, it's a good thing because people have been through it before. So we're not as fearful of these things as you might be in other more stable economic environments. But at the same time, if you get too comfortable with levels of failure and your coping skills get to be too advanced, you start to feel like status quo is in kind of a transitional environment where you never really get anywhere. And this is the challenge that I'm in. And I think a lot of organizations in our city are in that same boat, trying to figure out, what do we need to do now? And if you had any challenges with your business model, with your finances, your fundraising, these kinds of crises, they expose all that. So you're kind of stuck with where you are at the moment. And as a leader, I felt challenged by trying to figure out, what do I really need to be worried about? And what should I just say, okay, that's not going to work. We don't even have time to deal with that. And so I'm sure you've seen that before in different projects even, and how you have to abandon.
Also born and raised in Detroit and still have family there. So
yeah, so you know the deal,
Well,
but we're resilient. They're resilient in Detroit, but it starts to become a little too familiar where you can't see out of it.
Well, and I think obviously resiliency, both for our organizations and our staff and our visitors, as a matter of fact, especially in a community, the many communities in Detroit. But you can't tread water forever,
No.
and so treading water isn't a great place to be. One thing you mentioned previously in terms of working shoulder to shoulder with people. I just, maybe you could touch on, when you are moving through transition, and we said before, these things are a team sport. How do you get the buy-in? How do you get past that sort of treading water, or this, they say in digital things, always in beta. I don't know if your museum wants to be always in beta. So
always in beta.
How do you get that buy-in? How do you get that input, that sort of team effort to move things forward and move out of that sort of pure transition and spinning your wheels phase?
That's a great question. And I will say, if I may speak about just my overall experience in museums, not necessarily in this situation, because I've been through challenges and at other museums, and very different from this, but they all kind of come in the same sort of package. Something happens, an event. It's just almost like an 8-point arc of a storyline in a novel. You know, there's a stasis where people are sitting around at the beach, and then all of a sudden they look up and an asteroid is coming towards Earth, you know, and
Look,
that's
there's Godzilla.
right. There's Godzilla, you know, and you have to figure out what to do. And I think there's some people that say, yeah, whatever. I've been through so much at this museum. It's just another thing that's going to happen. I just have to hunker down and go through it. There are other people that are completely freaked out. You know, what are we going to do? We can't communicate online. I'm using Microsoft Teams and everyone's on Zoom, or someone's using free conference call and another person is texting me while I'm receiving emails, and my kids, you know, are running around behind me. Like, all of this is the reality. I'm certainly experiencing it. But I think in museums, the one thing that I like to lean on more than anything else is the mission. Because as a not-for-profit, the profit motive that you typically get in a capitalistic economic system has a different kind of twist to it in a not-for-profit, where the motive is really achievement and impact on the mission. Now, I'm not saying that everybody that I've worked with, or everyone that you've worked with, whoever's listening to this in your audience, the professionals out there, are all bought into the mission. But that's the one thing that's helped me during the most, as an individual, museum professional. I always look back on the mission and say, I'm not giving up on this mission, so whatever I have to do is what I have to do. Now, I find some peace in that. Others are more interested in whose budgets are being changed, or why did my staff, you know, get cut, and there's lots of politics. But the most important thing, I think, to motivate on is mission, and you should do that early and often. And the reason why is you've got to know who's really in it when their back is against the wall, when the chips are down. You know, the people that are really going to be with you and bought into whatever needs to happen are the folks that believe in the mission. And as long as that mission is not changing, and as a leader, you stand close to it, then the rest is really details. I feel it's really details. Now, those details might be a little bit more dramatic in some stories than others. But in the case that we're in now, it's very simple. If your organization is having cancellations like we went through during this COVID-19, you know, when I saw the Louvre shut down, that's when I was like, whoa, you know, I kind of like, you know, woke up on that one. And then weeks later, we're in the same situation where schools are canceled. The public's not showing up. We weren't at a stay-at-home order or shutdown, you know, statewide at that point. But everyone said, should we close? What are we going to do? Some museums on our campus are closing. So I was like, look, if nobody shows up to your facility, you're effectively closed. So it's an easy decision. As much as we think, oh, so we have to make tough decisions, it's not really. Because when a crisis, not just a bump in the road or something that happens, when a crisis hits, the situation dictates the strategy. If people are not showing up, you close your doors. Now, the question was, what should we do when we're closed, but we can still go to work? So we decided to clean up the building, disinfect things, fix broken exhibits. We used it as a shutdown period. Then it got extended, and we started thinking, maybe we should create more content. And that's when we originally talked about, in the first couple of days, should we do online programming? And we already had some infrastructure for that, but we launched our Echo at Home program through Facebook Live, and it got really great attention, online science experiments, and that was a big deal for us. But did we change the mission? No. Our mission was still inspiring curious minds and introducing people to STEM, you know, connecting to communities. And we were just doing that in an online environment. Now, our business model changed, but the mission did not. And so I think it's important for leaders to try to separate those things out for a crisis. What's in that mission? What's in the business model? Hopefully your mission is not going to change because you're thinking long-term through hurricanes, through volcanoes, through storms, whatever, sinkholes. But that other part of it is the business model. And when people are interacting and engaging with you, if the channels are different, if the value proposition needs to change because someone is at home, then that's where the disruption takes place. And sometimes we're not always willing as leaders and as nonprofits to flex.
So it's interesting. It seems like there's that dynamic tension between the stability and the, if you like, the North Star of the mission, which to me is an argument for having a clear and accessible mission, not something that is like 5 pages or 5 paragraphs or stuff, but
I'm with
also
you. I'm with you.
being able to be flexible and be able to pivot as the situation dictates. So maybe you just mentioned the Echo program, the Facebook Live, but what are some other kinds of things you're thinking about both now as you're shut down, but also I'm sure you and your staff are thinking about, okay, what happens after we reopen and how are we going to reopen? So I'd just be
Yeah.
curious about your mindset for that, because I'm sure lots of other people are sort of pondering those things. Okay, what
Paul,
can
you're
we
right.
do? What can we do now? But we're going to
Very soon.
reopen.
Hmm.
How is that going to happen? So
Yeah, I think this is there's a point at which there's the eye of the storm or a lull in the action in every crisis, and that I think is probably the most dangerous part because the situation is swirling and it's not really clear. Although in the early stages when we were trying to react to even the state of Michigan shutting down and the governor getting on TV and making these proclamations about what you stay inside and these businesses need to shut down and this is going to be enforced and this is going to be encouraged, that was happening on a daily basis. So it was like barrage after volley after wave of change, and it's tiring. If you've been in a surf and you just get pummeled by wave after wave, and after a while you can get sick in just 3 or 4 feet of water just being pummeled by waves, and it's challenging. But then there's a point at which things calm down, you get a little further out and you start to learn how you were talking about treading water and floating, and that's actually the most dangerous period because you don't really know whether you want to go backwards or you want to go forward. And in some cases, the backwards might be the team saying, we're not trained for this. The forwards might be some gung-ho staff member that's like, guys, this is exactly what we need to do. And then you have to at least either coach that, quarterback it, or referee what's going on as a leader. And that's not always, um, it's not always a comfortable place to be in, because you mentioned the term agility or being agile. Your leadership might have to change. You might have to get more into a command and control style just so that people can hear you. In other cases, you want to just listen and take it in. So what I find comforting is to really try to put a chart together for yourself. And this would be a great exercise for those people who have done this. What do you think is going to change and what's going to stay the same? The things that are changing are really good for the folks that are active, that really want to go out there and grab the bull by the horns. The things that are staying the same are the folks that like a little bit of calm and they like some structure and just knowing that thing. So when you do an exercise like this, you kind of get to divide your group into two pieces. And the group that's on one side can look at the other and become more comfortable with it, knowing that there are people over there, and vice versa. And that's a way to start. So that's kind of how I was looking at it, because as much as people were on the news and on Twitter and this changes everything and everything's going to change, you know what? Not really. We're human beings. We go through lots of things like this, not to trivialize it, because people's lives are at stake and people have already lost their lives in this. But there are challenges that we deal with. But the thing about humans that makes us so unique is our adaptability, for better or for worse. But we know how to use tools to adapt to things. So I don't know, maybe all of our visitors will come in wearing gloves and masks and they'll have just as good a time as they had before. Or maybe they're scared to death to be anywhere near downtown or midtown Detroit, and they don't want to come in at all. So somewhere in there, at least we know the parameters, right? And so I think it's a negotiation. So the agility and getting people focused is just as you said, Paul. It's really about people being comfortable with this idea of transition. So what I try to do is to make the transitions as small as possible. If the gap between the potential difference is close enough, even with a low voltage, you can get a spark. And that's what we're looking for, is a spark. And so How do we as leaders begin to evaluate that? I think you have to start with, here's what we think is going to change, and here's what's going to stay the same. Because most of the time, what's going to stay the same is like the lion's share of what's going on. And what's going to really change is much smaller. And it gives you a sense of stability and some comfort in the fact that, hey guys, we can do this.
Now that's a really good approach. You know, it's funny, while you were talking and, you know, we're thinking about big transitional times in history and maybe United States history, I can't help but think about the play Hamilton, you know, the George
Yes,
Washington talking about
right.
we're outgunned, we're outmanned, and you know, you're talking about that, and then also in the eye of the hurricane, it's interesting.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah.
people in this country have gone through very difficult events before, obviously, which again, not to trivialize, but is hopeful that, you know, we are resilient and we have tools at our disposal, which is a good segue maybe to wrap us up. Do you have any off the top of your head? And also, I mentioned before we started recording too, we can always include some in the description on the YouTube video, but do you have any sort of go-to resources or people or books or things related to management or the kinds of issues we've been talking about that come to mind?
I'll throw a couple out. You know, one for agility. You know, I believe it was in 2000 or 2001. A group of software engineers got together in Aspen and dealing with projects and how to keep up with the pace of change in software. And they drew up a list of kind of rules and norms called the Agile Manifesto. And you can go online and you can look up the Agile Manifesto, but they list out all these things that the reasons why some waterfall project management techniques didn't work under a rapidly and changing business environment. And they ended up coming up with the concept of Agile, and in particularly Scrum, which is a brand of Agile project management. What was interesting about it is it wasn't like they just threw out the previous project management systems. What they did was they just wanted to change the emphasis. And so I would say when you look at all the variables of what we're going through right now, is there a way as an organization, just like you see someone using a soundboard at a concert, they just kind of tweak it just a little bit more here and give the guitar a little bit more and the vocals. You know, they're trying to manage the emphasis as the dynamics of the song changes. And we need to create a board for that, because in some cases, you don't need to throw everything out. You just need to change the emphasis. For us, the ECHO program was something we were already doing. We weren't doing it quite the way we do it now in this at-home science environment, but the infrastructure was there. So we just pumped up the volume on that and got people to see something that looked wonderful, as if we were reacting to it, but to some extent, it was something we already knew how to do, which was good. Now, it's changed for this environment, and now we're learning how to do it differently. But that would be something to look up: Agile project management. Another thought I had that started with some of the first things you talked about was around the concept of innovation. And Alois Schumpeter, I think it was, is the person who coined that term, innovation, way back when. And he had described it as, oh gosh, what, destructive, you know, it'll come to me what it is. I had it at the tip of my tongue, but it was this idea that that innovation is essentially the successful exploitation of an idea, and that our ideas about what the future might be because of COVID-19, the impacts are going to change. But if we're not exploiting them, and that's a term that's really strong, but what it says is, you know, you got to grab this idea and turn it into something. You have to take something from conception to completion, and you need to be deliberate about that. And right now is the time to do that. Pick what it is as part of your mission that works in this environment, and just do that. Because a lot of other stuff you want to do with summer camps and schools and everything, you have no control over. As much as we want to say that we're going to launch this program, you just don't have any control over it. The things you have control over, do that first, build a foundation, and move on. And then finally, I would say that another piece really that I think is important is change management. And really change management is this idea of freezing, it's like states of matter when you look at water. And there's actually a point, it's called the triple point of water, in which water can exist in a gaseous, a solid, and a liquid state, which blew my mind when I discovered this.
There are some great videos that show that.
Yeah, it's just like, how is that possible? You think about, and sometimes in the chaos of crisis, it's really, you're trying to figure out, is it a solid? Is it are we stable? Is this changing? But really, you might be in a place with a certain temperature and pressure in which all three states of, or at least three of those states of matter exist. What do you do? And I think you want to try to at least increase the heat or chill something down or expand the volume of space. And so what we tried to do is say, well, we don't have enough energy to turn the heat up, and we don't have the ability to chill anything. So what if we just expand the space in which we work? Would that allow us to get the phase change that we want, which is to kind of freeze things a little bit so that we can stand on something and move forward? And so I think we can take some of these concepts from science and from STEM for those that are watching this in the STEM community, or even the artistic community, about design and how we want to design for a future. But there's that point at which, and I'll leave you with this, as a leader, you get so frustrated of reacting to things. You're like, you know what? I'm going to put a stake in the ground and I'm just going to let I'm going to let Godzilla come to me. So that's kind of what we're doing now at the Michigan Science Center, is saying, you know what? We've been through a lot. This city has been through a lot. We're going to just plant our feet in the ground, draw a line in the sand, and let all the change come to us, because this guessing game and the running around reacting wears you down. And it's sometimes easier to just stick to your mission and just say, whatever comes through these gates, you'll be ready for. So that's my statement.
That's a great way to end. Christian, I really appreciate you taking the time. And as somebody who was born and raised in Detroit, and who way back when, one of my first museum jobs for a little bit of time was working on the floor at then the Detroit Science Center.
I love it. I love it.
I wish you and your staff and your stakeholders nothing but success there. Hopefully Godzilla doesn't come to visit, but
hopefully not.
I think the balance that you're talking about, the stability of mission and the sort of creativity and agility of managing how those two things keep in balance, I think are always challenging. And you're a man up to the challenge. So I look forward to see what continues to happen at the Michigan Science Center. Again, thanks very much. I appreciate you taking the time.
I love your program. Let's get some more of these up. These are great.